Good afternoon. It's just gone 1 o'clock on Wednesday, the 4th of June, 2025. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Charles Mallet, and joining me in the studio today is Brian Gerrish. Welcome to the programme, Brian.
Thank you.
Brian's going to be analysing the comments made by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as well as looking at the ground truth in Ukraine at the moment, particularly following Operation Spiderweb, as reported earlier in the week. We're also going to be joined remotely by Vanessa Beeley from Lebanon, who's going to be scrutinising the murky affairs of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, as well as looking at foreign fighters in Syria. And we also have Sandy Adams on a remote link from Somerset, talking about the Ocean Conference, access to what are called blue spaces and indeed natural resources, as well as a look at the most recent attack on the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. But we're going to start with the Strategic Defence Review. And the situation is that we're all going to war. At least that is, without doubt, the central message from the Defence Review, which has been released on Monday. Back in February, UK Column surmised that the content of the review would be based on the suggestion that the country faces an existential threat, and that this, for the most part, concerns what is consistently described as Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. There are nearly 80 references to the ongoing conflict in the document, and this is what Keir Starmer had to say about it.
The moment has arrived to transform how we defend ourselves and to renew our nation. An investment in British pride and the British people. A defence dividend that will be felt in the pockets of working people and the prosperity of the country, securing growth for generations to come. Part of a new contract to unite the kingdom, a new spirit of service flowing from every part of society, from the supply lines to the front lines, everyone benefiting, everyone playing their role, doing their duty to the nation and to each other, to preserve our way of life and the things that we hold dear. Because when it comes to security and renewal, nothing works unless we all work together.
There it is. And as though it were a Hollywood production, we'll just continue to look on screen at the trailer that the government's put out recently. The government, of course, has been releasing several dramatic trailers of the Defence Review, and each containing the same fundamental tenets based on an incorrect premise. The first duty of government, of course, is not, as the state would have it, national security. It should be to protect the powerless from the powerful. This review is very obviously product of its three key authors, they being George Robertson, formerly Secretary General to NATO and a previous Defence Secretary during the Blair years, Fiona Hill, former member of the US intelligence architecture, possibly not former, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's also a dedicated Russophobe, and she has compared Putin to Hitler in the past. And then Richard Barrons, the former Commander Joint Forces Command, with his own defence industry consultancy and an avowed interest in AI and space. So there are plenty of conflicts of interest here, and this will be something that Mike Robinson will focus more on in Friday's programme. Now, in summary, or at least with regard to the content of the review summarised, which is far too detailed to cover in any great depth in the programme, the main points are put by the government as being the move to warfighting readiness, and this draws directly on the integrated operating concept, which has been mentioned consistently on this programme. Next, of course, with Robertson in mind, is the idea that it is NATO first, with the review stating that the UK remains at the forefront of NATO efforts to safeguard the Euro-Atlantic against growing Russian aggression in all domains, providing the ultimate guarantee of UK and allied security in declaring its nuclear deterrence to the alliance. Now, there's a lot more in the review on the nuclear issue, and it's made very clear that nuclear war is not now considered as being a remote possibility. Indeed, and I quote, "Nuclear deterrence can no longer be considered separately from the wider strategic environment, as described in Chapter 2. Any future crisis or conflict in which the UK is engaged may include nuclear-armed or nuclear-aspiring states willing to use nuclear threats to compel or constrain UK and allied decision-making." And lastly is the idea that defence, or rather war, is the product of what is being called a whole society approach. And there's a sense of immediacy here with the recommendation on education that, to quote the review, to meet the changing needs of the integrated force, education must be whole force by default, single service by exception. And they say by the end of 2026, defence must establish a career education pathway for the whole force, regulars, reserves, and civil service, designed to respond to the changing ways of warfare over time and with NATO at its heart. End quote. So with recruitment and retention in mind, both of which are in a parlous state, as has been reported here many times, there are initiatives such as improved investment in housing, though nothing really which suggests that the spectre of conscription will fade away. And even though the message has been one of we're not ready yet for the past 3 years, here's Richard Barrons speaking about the apparent sense of urgency in how the money gets spent.
People have had this ambition, genuinely held it previously, but how do we get from thinking about it, wanting it, planning it, to a more Ukraine-like war footing where these things are sort of racing through the supply chain and the development and getting out to the front line?
So I think there are a number of things really in our favour now, and you're right that some of this thinking has been around for a while now. It's just taken time to gestate. The first reason this is different is we live in a much more threatening world, and so you probably don't have the luxury of trying to stay the same. You've got to change to stay safe and deter effectively. The second thing is we have the experience of Ukraine, and Ukraine is an illustration of war in the digital age. It's not a perfect template for how we would fight, but we've learnt lessons in military technology and also in the industrial arrangements that you need to make that work.
Change to stay safe. What do you make of it, Brian?
I think, Charles, it's a huge propaganda exercise. I'm slightly cynical because I'm the age I am, and I've seen a lot of these defence reviews come and go. They've all been a lot of words, glossy paper, and at the end of the review, it's never been implemented fully. So you end up with some improvements, but overall a decline in the armed forces. And we've just been having a look at some interesting statistics here. Relax, it's from Full Fact, so it must be correct. But essentially, if we look, the track record is a consistent decline in UK's armed forces. We're at the point at the moment where we're talking around about 71, possibly 73,000 people in the army. When I first came into the military scene way back in 72, total personnel 371,000, and I think for you, Charles, it was still up at 298. And now we're in this pitiful situation where we can't put troops on the ground. The reality is the success of the Russians in the war in Ukraine has shaken this government to its boots, and they're now desperate to try and pull UK's destroyed military. They want to rabbit out of the hat. So I think this is all words. We will see some new equipment, but my prediction is if we're speaking in 5 years' time, we'll be saying what has not worked.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Brian. And going back to Richard Barrons, I mean, what he mentions only obliquely is the main driver of all of this, which of course is the war industry. Now, the government has put out several announcements about specific funding initiatives across the whole of the UK, which this map shows. Now, there's much more to deal with, and we will doubtless talk about this much more in extra, but I would like to leave you with this chart from the Financial Times, which shows how the arms industry benefits and has benefited over the past 5 years. Now, if you're listening rather than watching, the upward trend shown is completely out of kilter with the all-share line shown at the bottom, which has barely moved by comparison. And with the focus of the messaging on the commercial collaboration, it would seem reasonable to predict that this trend will continue and that this investment will cause precisely the sorts of threats which are alluded to materialise, and thus the circle turns. So we'll come back to that in extra, but for now we will go across to Vanessa in Lebanon. And as I say, you're going to be talking about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. We've got no sound.
Of course,
It's all right, Vanessa. Sorry, carry on.
Am I back?
You are back.
Am I there? Oh, okay. Yeah, basically, so this is the multi-spectrum genocide that is being waged against Palestinians in Gaza and, of course, in the West Bank. And there has been this humanitarian aid complex established to supplant the UNRWA agency that, of course, the Zionists have been trying to eradicate for a number of years, which was the primary UN agency providing aid and food to Palestinians in all areas of the world, even the areas where, of course, they're living in diaspora and unable to return. So if we could just have a quick look at the Washington Post headline, U.S. consulting firm quits Gaza humanitarian aid efforts amid criticism. And if we just have a look at the text within the article, on Friday, a leading U.S. management consulting firm hired last fall to help design the program and run its business operations withdrew its team operating on the ground in Tel Aviv. A spokesperson for the firm, Boston Consulting Group, said the company had terminated its contract with GHF and placed one of the senior partners leading the project on leave, pending an internal review. And of course, one can say this isn't terribly surprising when you look at the figures of those that have been killed while they've been gathering to receive the aid. So 102 so far killed and 490 now, up to almost 500 injured. And of course, what's been happening is that there have been centers established that are effectively being run, as we've talked about before, by American private military contractors, better known as military mercenaries. And I would recommend that everybody does a deep dive into this article by the Grey Zone. I'll just run through some of the main points that it makes. Top Israeli lawmakers have accused the Zionist regime of laundering millions through U.S. humanitarian organizations and private military contractors, as I said, as we've talked about previously on UK Column. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was established in Switzerland in February, supplanting UNRWA. It received over 100 million from an undisclosed donor. But the Israeli opposition member and former Deputy Prime Minister Avigdor Lieberman has said that Mossad and the Israeli Defense Ministry are covertly funding GHF. So that gives an indication as to entirely what this organization is determined to do, which of course is to increase, one, the starvation levels in Gaza, because if we look at this map, which was embedded in the Grey Zone article, the humanitarian islands in Gaza plan interim phase. So you can see basically the red pins there demonstrate, I think there's only 7 actual aid points. And of course, in northern Gaza, the majority of people have been told to evacuate to a tiny area in the south. So 2 million Gazans basically being kettled into that smaller area in the south there. And so those northern ones are largely not doing anything. But what this is doing is creating IDP camps, internally displaced people camps, and then providing these so-called humanitarian aid points. And again, if we look at this, so that first of all, there has to be security inspection during entry on the aid. So that's one delay. Then you have the biometric certificate. This again is what we talked about, actual biometric surveillance of these IDP camps. And only the approved Palestinians will receive aid. And then basically there's distribution to these IDP cities, note the term city. So basically what this is all doing is further corralling Gazans into smaller and smaller, ever shrinking concentration camps that are now literally camps, refugee sites, internally displaced people camps. Then the aid is provided, as we said, only to those that are approved by these American private military contractors. They have to go through a series of security measures to be allowed to receive the aid. And then once the starving people are basically in the lines to receive the aid and chaos naturally breaks out because of the starvation levels they've been forced to endure, the IDF is opening fire on them and killing them because effectively they've been drawn out into the open and they can be murdered wantonly by the Israelis. So yet again, anything that is described as aid by the Zionist entity or by its allies in the UK, EU, or US cannot be seen as such. It can only be seen as a further element of genocide against the Palestinians.
Very depressing. Vanessa, thank you very much indeed. And I should point out the link to the Grey Zone piece will be in the show notes, as indeed it will be to everything else that Vanessa's spoken about. Now, Brian, you've been following what Marco Rubio has been up to recently.
I have, and I know there's controversy around him, and he's not everybody's cup of tea, but I was listening to him speaking to the American Compass organization. If you've never heard of that, I hadn't either, but it's an organization promoting family, community, and industry to help underpin the nation. We're talking about the USA, of course, the nation's liberty and prosperity. So this was their 5th annual event. Let's have a listen to what Rubio had to say.
And then in 1989 and 1990, 91, it was my first years in college. And literally the entire world just transformed before my very eyes. Understand, you grow up your whole life and like the whole world is about the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union no longer exists. My favorite memory of that is that I was actually taking a course that fall by a Soviet expert at, I think it was in Gainesville, Florida. And this poor guy's entire career came coming down over a 3-month period as the Soviet Union collapsed. It's like all these years of work, you have a PhD in Soviet studies, and now the Soviet doesn't exist anymore. So I don't know what he did after that. I need to check up on that guy. But anyways, the point is the whole world transformed. And there was this effusive exuberance, the belief that the Cold War is over, we won, and now the entire world is going to become just like us. Free enterprise democracies. That was a very idealistic thing to believe. But here's the other conclusion they made, and that is that nationhood no longer mattered when it came to economics. That right now the world would no longer have borders. It wouldn't matter where things were made. What mattered is they were made in the most efficient place. And it became mantra. And look, I think it became part of Republican orthodoxy for a very long time, an orthodoxy that I came up in, which was, it's okay if productive capacity moves to another country, because what that will do is it will free up our workers to do work that's even more productive and pays them more. It was the famous or the infamous idea that who cares that you lost your job at a factory, you're going to learn how to code, and then you're going to make a lot more money doing that. Well, it was completely unrealistic, number one, and became incredibly disruptive if that decision was made. But here's the other implication of it. It robbed the nation of its industrial capacity, of its ability to make things. And its industrial capacity and its ability to make things has 2 ramifications. The first is it hurts your economy. It hurts your country. It robs people of jobs, and the transition is not nearly as easy, but it also ends up becoming corrosive and destructive to communities. And as a result, we had a Rust Belt. We had places that were gutted.
So what I found so interesting about that talk is a lot of what he says is, of course, factually correct. These things did happen. There was a focus on the global economy, and for US and other nation states, productivity absolutely declined to the extent that widespread poverty existed. Came into being in America. It's happened in UK as well. He talks about a plan for a world with no borders. This sounds very familiar. I'm sure Sandy's will have something to say about that in a minute. And robbed of our industrial capacity. So all these things he's describing, factually correct. This has certainly happened in the US and it's happened in the West. But then he's used that wonderful little phrase, they. What he doesn't talk about is the people that actually created the globalist policy that America followed or engaged with, which caused all the problems in the first place. So he's not talking about the United Nations even. He's not talking about the World Economic Forum. He's not talking about the Trilateral Commission. He's not mentioning any of the organizations which not only created the policies he now says destroyed America, they are still destroying America. So let's have a listen to a little bit more of this.
And all of a sudden that company or that field vanished because it moved somewhere else where it was cheaper to do, and those jobs were gone, and obviously became incredibly destructive, not just for the United States, by the way, but for many nations in the industrialized West. But the other thing it robbed us of is the ability to make things, which is a national security impairment, and a very significant one. And that's never changed. That's always been true. And so today what you find is, because of all of those years of neglect, because of the loss of industrial capacity, we didn't just undermine our society, we didn't just undermine our domestic economy, we've undermined our position in the world. And what you will find, and what we find even now, is that increasingly on geopolitical issue after geopolitical issue, it is access to raw material and industrial capacity that is at the core both of the decisions that we're making and the areas that we're prioritizing. Part of the decisions that were made were, in the end, if something is good for the global economy, that's really what matters. Ultimately, a lot of public policy decisions were made without the nation state in mind. Rather, the decision was, is this good for the global economy? The other, which is more broad, but I think also ties to economic policy, is the following. Part of the decisions that were made were, in the end, if something is good for the global economy, that's really what matters. Ultimately, a lot of public policy decisions were made without the nation state in mind. Rather, the decision was, is this good for the global economy?
So again, some very, very interesting comments there. He's saying that the nation state was basically overlooked for the global economy. And this has taken America into a dangerous place. Notice he said that making things equals national security. And here we are in UK, where supposedly the government's brought in a defence review. And what is it actually, what's actually happening? Well, our ability to make steel just about gone. Our ability to produce munitions gone. We need the Germans to help us produce barrels for weapons on the battlefield. So our manufacturing absolutely destroyed by successive governments, and that equals a direct attack on national security. So where does Rubio sit? Do I trust him? No, I don't. If he starts to talk about the people that have brought in these agendas, such as the World Economic Forum, then we know he's on the right path. If he doesn't, this is another complete distraction for the American public in this case. Sandy, I don't know whether you've got a very quick comment on that.
Absolutely. I mean, everything that we had has gone. Everything's been lost, and you know, as a nation state, the UK has been hollowed out from inside for a number of years, and we know really who's behind that. So I totally get what you're saying. He's not to be trusted because he's not calling out the actors involved. He's just kind of brushing over it. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We everything is gone really that we held dear. Yeah. I think I'm just going to talk today about the ocean conference that's happening, and this is all part of this big agenda that is really taking everything away from us and putting it into corporate hands, and that's what we're seeing, and that's really what Rubio was talking about, but he's not calling them out. Yeah, last month I covered David Attenborough's 99th birthday and the launch of his new film Ocean, which he's proudly shown to schools throughout the country to get children involved in saving the planet. And he's kind of lamenting that he's not going to live to see his great work seen. And you know, the thing is that the film was released to coincide with the Ocean Conference. You know, this is about the children going, you know, having the all this propaganda put into the schools, but it's on the back of this Ocean Conference that's happening in Nice next week. So really, the conference is being held in Nice. It's called the Ocean Conference, and it's really taking into account Goal 14 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's all about conserving, conservation and sustainability. This is what they're talking about: the use of the oceans, the seas, and marine resources, or it's sustainable development, really. And what they're sort of going into is the targets they're looking at is reducing marine pollution, managing and protecting marine ecosystems, minimizing ocean acidification, regulating overfishing, prohibiting farming, harmful farming subsidies, and increasing scientific knowledge, and enhancing the conservation and sustainable use of oceans through international law, and stopping the plastic and all that kind of stuff. And it all sounds great, doesn't it? It's who wouldn't agree with cleaning up the oceans for future generations? And this is what Sustainable Development 14 is proposing that it's doing. But there's it's a very, like all the goals, 14 is sold as a necessary benefit to mankind. But there's also a darker side to this, and it's related to the financial aspect of ecosystems through what is referred to as the blue economy, which involves financializing the sea resource, all the resources under the sea and the seabed, rather than focusing solely on the conservation and environmentalism side. So there's always what they give with one hand, it's all about wonderful stuff like cleaning up the oceans and everything. But on the other side, we've got this really this new economy that they're pulling out of a hat. So on the 7th and 8th of June, the Blue Economy and Finance Forum are hosting a less publicised event in Monaco at the Grimaldi Forum in Monaco. And this forum is designated as a UN Ocean Conference special event, and it aims to mobilise funding to restore ocean health and accelerate the transition to a sustainable and regenerative blue economy. Christine Lagarde is going to be speaking there, of course. And so the blue economy is presented as a new model for sustainable ocean-based development. It promotes ocean industries like offshore energy, marine biotechnology, ecotourism, and seabed mining, all under the promise of green growth and climate resilience. But in reality, it's a means of financializing, the ocean floor and the oceans, and turning marine life, ecosystems, and even the seabed itself into a tradable economic asset. The valuable minerals of the seabed are needed to fuel the fourth industrial revolution, the green economy. At the end of the day, that's what they're doing. Through mechanisms like blue bonds, ecosystem service valuations, and carbon offsetting, oceans are increasingly being absorbed into the financial system. Nature is being replaced, packaged, and sold, and coastal mangroves become carbon credits, fish stocks become debt instruments, and ocean health becomes a line in the whole ESG portfolios. So it's a kind of a seabed gold rush, really, and it's control over marine resources that shifts from communities to banks, hedge funds, and multinational corporations. So small fishing communities are being treated like a threat to the environment, but big companies are being allowed to expand, like massive fish farms, huge offshore wind farms, and deep sea mining operations. So, at the end of the day, it's global organizations like the UN and the World Bank and powerful charities are creating plans to divide up the ocean. As a result, small fisheries and fishermen and smaller communities could be, that all their activities could be made illegal. And a lot of it is all about foreign debt or aid, in return for these nations to give up control of their own waters, known as exclusive economic zones, EEZs, areas that could benefit, their own people. These are being sort of swapped, really, for it was almost like a nature swaps, debt for nature swaps, so that the people don't actually have a say in all this. It's all being handed over to big corporations. So I just want to look at the closer look at the sponsors of this, and of course, you'll see that Prince Albert of Monaco plays a pivotal role in these initiatives. He, along with the World Economic Forum and all the major actors, and he's the founder and the president of the Prince Albert II of Monaco's foundation, which organises the Monaco Ocean Week in collaboration with the Monaco government and the Monaco Yacht Club. And in addition to the Blue Economy Finance Forum, Monaco Ocean Week features various events, including the Monaco Smart Yacht Rendezvous and the Environmental Symposium organised by the Yacht Club in Monaco. And these events focus on, quote, sustainable yachting and innovative solutions for ocean protection. And Albert's involvement underscores Monaco's dedication to the ocean preservation and its leadership in promoting sustainable practices in marine environments. So, if you look at this yacht, this huge super yacht thing, maybe I'm missing something, but there's nothing sustainable about smart super yachts for the super rich. So in short, the blue economy means nature is not protected, but monetized, and local stewards are displaced by global stakeholders. And where oceans are no longer a shared heritage, they become a financial instrument. So it's not conserving life below water, and it's more about who profits from it. So that's what I'm finding anyway.
Great, Sandy, thank you very much indeed. And you're absolutely right in terms of putting a value on it. And it's worth pointing out this coincides absolutely with the publication of reports from the UK government about access to what they're calling green spaces and blue spaces. And the point of that, of course, is to put exactly that value on it. Now, you may or may not know that UK Column only exists because of the support received from donors and members. So to that end, if you would like to make a donation, then you can do so via the website, or indeed join as a member, either on a monthly, an annual, or a lifetime basis. And we'd be delighted if you would do so. You might like to go to the shop and pick up some UK Column merchandise, or indeed look at Clive de Carle's products, from which we receive a small commission. Now, it's very important that you do share our material wherever possible, because the various platforms do not like us to be able to do so, which means that we have to work that bit harder, and this is how you would do it. Now, I'm pleased to say that the interview that went out yesterday, Ben Rubin talking to Paul Atherton of the Royal Society for Arts and Manufacture and Commerce, has been very well received, and I would encourage you to listen to how it has been subverted. Tomorrow, Diane Rasmussen-McAddy talks to Vicky Baggett, who is challenging the library system in the United States, particularly on the sexualization of content of literature for children, and that falls in line with the series of interviews that Diane's been running, particularly with relation to Diane Kleinman and indeed the organisation that they are both part of now. Tomorrow, there is going to be a seminar on the assisted dying bill, which you can tune into if you follow the link, which will be in the show notes. And then getting out and about, UK Column will be at the Sounds Beautiful Festival in Dorset at the end of this month. So please do have a look at getting a ticket there. That will be a great event, and be delighted to see people in person. And on the in-person front, you'll also be able to enjoy beer, truth and freedom all at the same time in Thetford towards the end of July 18th and 19th. And again, a link to that in the show notes, so please do get along to it. And then UK Column will be appearing again at the Hope Freedom Music Festival over the August bank holiday this August rather. So lots going on. Please sign up for some of or all of it, and we'd be absolutely delighted to see you there. Now, that takes us to the after effects of what was called Operation Spiderweb, and an examination of what is or has been going on in Ukraine, which Brian is going to have a look at for us now.
Okay, thank you for that, Charles. Well, just a very quick comment, but of course we've seen Western media, newspapers and TV video streams alike absolutely crowing at the recent attacks on Russia, never mind how dangerous these were in view of the fact that it implicated Russian strategic assets. But at times radio has been one of the leaders of this, that they seem to regard war as a joke, and they were full of good humour because of the Kerch Bridge bombing. So I'm just putting this one up as an image to reflect the type of things that the Times and other Western media is putting across. But of course, the reality of what's happening on the battlefield, we can't rely on mainstream media, but we can rely on some very hardworking amateurs. And I'm just going to bring up defence, let's bring it up here, Defence Politics Asia. I've mentioned before, there's a number of these people, and I'm trying to give them all credit for what they're doing. But the reality on the battlefield, of course, is Russian advances. Yes, very slow, but this is the whole point of the Russian tactics. It's a creeping advance. It's like lava moving. And the reality is that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield. And at the time we start to talk peace, surprise, surprise, we get these attacks on Russia, mainland Russia. So, Sandy, you were really quite taken, I think a little bit shocked by the attacks that took place over the over recent days. So tell us what you feel.
We had the drone attacks. Was it last week? And just in the last 24 hours, we've had the bombing of the Kerch Bridge in Crimea, which is a vital link between Crimea and the Russian mainland. And I've got a video of that bombing, and it's quite shocking, really, that it's a third attempt on this bridge, which is a vital lifeline. And it's held dear by Putin to actually. It was his. It was more than a bridge. It was a symbol of Russia's restoration of the Crimea. After the people voted to rejoin the Russian Federation in 2014. So let's see that video. Thank you. Yeah, it said, there it is being blown up. It was apparently the Ukrainian USB has admitted it. Here's one of their lieutenants, saying this is a trinity. It's the third attempt on Ukraine, on Russia, and he says God loves the Trinity, and we're going to continue to do it. Basically, this is really baiting the Russians and baiting Putin, and this is the drone attack, obviously, from last week. And it just shows you. 41 of Putin's planes were bombed, and this is what we're looking at. We're looking at a real baiting of the bear. It's absolutely blatant, and it's significant because this bridge really is a symbol of Russia's referendum, which the West continues to deny because they deny the right of people's self-determination when it suits their agenda. If they keep pushing this, sooner or later the response will escalate, because if you keep kicking the bear, eventually the bear turns round. And the tragedy is the people of Europe and America are being lied to. They're being told this war is a war for democracy, when in truth it's a war for global hegemony, as we know. They're being told Russia is the aggressor and that NATO has expanded to Russia's doorstep. They've broken every promise, armed every hostile neighbour, and now sponsors attacks on Russian soil. So let's be clear, the bombing of the Crimean Bridge was a message, and now Russia will send its own, I'm sure. Our governments are marching us into a war, and they've already committed acts of war in our name. So because of this madness, if it continues, we literally are, that Russia is forced to respond as any great nation would. And the next bridge to fall might not be Crimea, it might be the bridge between peace and annihilation. So, that's it, really.
Sandy, thank you very much for that. You indicated to me earlier this morning that the people, we're going to say in local communities, you've got good connectivity with the community. And you were saying to me that people are now starting to see through this. They're not treating the mainstream media reports as if they are the absolute truth. I find that extremely encouraging. The other thing I just wanted to add to your commentary is that the idea that the drone attacks across Russia on Russian strategic nuclear assets, the idea that was simply carried out by Ukraine is laughable. There would have been UK and possibly the US behind, but for Ukrainians to do it on their own, I don't think so. And I think we can say the same with these attacks on the Kursk bridge, because they would have needed Western expertise to help them carry out these attacks. And this is the reality. This is not a war of Ukraine versus Russia. It is NATO and Ukraine versus Russia. And we need to be accurate in how we describe this. People need to understand this. But Sandy, thank you very much. I'm encouraged that people are starting to see through what's happening. The reality of the war. Now, this is when it's difficult for UK column news, because people do say some of the information that we put across is very hard, it's very disturbing. But if we don't report the facts and the truth, what are we to do? Many people, as I've shown earlier in the news today, seem to think that war in Ukraine is a joke. It's something to be laughing and smiling about. Let's just hear commentary from the Russian diplomatic team, who were commenting a few days ago about dead bodies.
Literally, transfer 6,000 frozen bodies of Ukrainian soldiers, which are on storage with us. We've conducted all possible identification procedures, and we have organized special transport, and those bodies will be transferred to the Ukrainian side next week so that they can give them a decent burial. I don't know if there are any bodies that they want to give to us. We would accept them, but that is yet unknown. We also agreed on the most large-scale prisoner exchange. Those who are gravely wounded or gravely ill, that will be a humanitarian gesture on our side. As the Ukrainian side often speaks about the general need for a ceasefire, we proposed a specific ceasefire for 2 or 3 days on certain parts of the front, and it will now be worked out by our specialists, and this will include the cessation of drone operations and other things, so that the bodies can be collected by commanders. It is a hot time of the year, and there is a danger of epidemics, so we want to create the possibility, especially since the Russian army is advancing.
So we're into the real horrible truth about this battlefield. The scale of the violence is on a par with the worst of the violence in the Second World War. Massive losses. We still don't know the true figures, but between Russian and Ukrainian losses, we are certainly talking 1 million men. And the bulk of the casualties has fallen on the Ukrainian side. There is no doubt about this. And of course, what is being said in this little clip is that the Russians moving forward are having problems because they're moving into areas previously defended by Ukraine, where there are so many bodies. It's presenting a health hazard. And remember that leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch, Mike has shown this clip a couple of times, is very happy to say, well, we the UK, are fighting a proxy war against the Russians, but of course it's the Ukrainians that are taking the brunt of the casualties, the dead and the wounded. So this is a vicious war carried out by the West, but the UK is there at the forefront. And the Russians talking in terms of handing back 6,000 bodies. This is just one incident that they hold on ice. It's truly despicable. And of course, the British government and Starmer and those who voted for him should be ashamed. Now, there's something else that was reported by those Russian diplomats, so Vladimir Badinsky, who was the main man speaking. Let's listen to something else he talked about.
Now, regarding children. So, what did we hear recently? At the United Nations, at other platforms, we heard about 1.5 million Ukrainian children being abducted. Then we heard about 200,000 Ukrainian children. Now the official figure is 20,000 children. And we tried to get any documentary evidence, any corroboration statements from parents, but there was nothing, no lists, and we have a permanently operating children's ombudsman, and children who found themselves in a difficult situation in the battle zone, they're evacuated. And if their families are found, the children are reunited with their families. They're given back to those families. So what are the actual numbers? We finally received the full list. As you see, it's not 1.5 million and not 20,000. 339 names. So this number is a very visual indication of the fact that the entire story with abducted children is just a media operation aiming to impress Europeans. There is not a single child who was abducted. But there were children who were saved by our soldiers, risking their lives, who risked their lives to carry out those children from the battle zone, and we are now looking for their parents. And if we find those parents, we give the children back to the family. And there are dozens of such cases.
Well, there we are. Very interesting testimony compared to the propaganda that we've seen from Western media. Do I believe that the Russians are squeaky clean on this? I suspect not entirely, because we're in a battlefield situation. But there are a number of extremely harrowing videos which you can watch on social media, which are from the battlefield, showing Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian soldiers trying to evacuate civilians, elderly men, women, children from the battlefield zones, or the zones which are under fire from both sides, and those Russian soldiers being targeted by drones, many of which, of course, will have been supplied by the West. Now, on the subject of children, back in 2016, Mike Robinson produced a couple of articles talking about basically the lies of the British government around unaccompanied children and the children disappearing. At the time, some 400 children from Syria who'd come to the UK unaccompanied by their parents. Those children disappeared. There was no major commentary from the BBC or the government on that. So that was one particular article. But Mike Robinson wrote a second one here on the 6th of October 2016, when he was talking about having tried to get an answer from Tim Farron about these Syrian children that had disappeared. But again, a wall of silence. So I'm going to say to our audience today, utter hypocrisy by the UK government over the subject of missing children. And if I can reinforce this statement, this document was brought to my attention from 2024, Eroding the Right to Family Life, Human Rights Violations in Britain's Child Protection Systems. It was written by the Children and Families Truth Commission. And if you get into some of the detail, I won't give it all, but you can see this in your own time. Essentially, the report is saying that the findings demonstrate that the children's social care system is profoundly harmful and unsupportive for families and children, and it's clearly incompatible with human rights legislation in the UK. In this section here of key findings, you will see the comments from families who've been affected by the system, and essentially they're saying no support, grossly unfair, inaccurate reports, nothing is independent, and the whole system is unjust as children are taken away from parents. So we'll have more on that in due course, but Vanessa, that's probably a very good segue to bring you in, because of course Syrian children have suffered on a massive scale, not only in the war zone, but outside of the war zone.
Yeah, absolutely. And not forgetting, of course, the MI6 incubated White Helmet organization that stands accused by the Syrian people of child abduction, organ trafficking, and child abuse, of course, in the staging of the chemical weapon attacks that were used to criminalize the former Syrian government. So Britain has its hand behind many of these most nefarious harvests, as they're known, of war. So I'm going to come back to Syria now and try to unravel some of the complications surrounding what's actually going on. And people may sometimes think I'm contradicting myself from previous reports, but it's a very fluid situation. There's huge power plays going on between a number of players in the region, some allies, some not. And even within the Jolani unelected regime itself, things are not all looking good for him. So most recently, Trump was talking about some of the concessions he was prepared to make if Jolani would give him assurances. And first of all, if we have a look at this article a few days ago in the Washington Post, Syrian leader faces the challenge of foreign militants who helped him win power. And of course, Trump is basically saying, or he was saying, that all the foreign militants must get out of Syria. So let's just have a look at some of or at least one of the main reasons that that's an issue for Jolani. The most hardline of these fighters are already turning their ire on Sharia, or Jolani as we know him, angry that he has not yet imposed Islamic Sharia law and alleging that he's cooperated with the US and Turkish forces to target extremist factions. Jolani is attacking us from the ground, America from the sky. And of course, this is nothing new. This is effectively what was happening when Jolani had dominance over Idlib, and the US was helping him eliminate his challenges for power in Idlib itself by drone strikes, having been given the coordinates by Jolani and his loyal militia. However, America, just as you said, Brian, with the talk from Rubio, America seems to be, let's say, chameleon-like changing its policy. So in the last 48 hours, Trump has said through his special envoy to Syria, Tom Barrack, US gives the nod to Syria to bring foreign jihadists and ex-rebels into the army. So a complete flip there by the United States. Tom Barrack basically pointed out that I would say there is an understanding with transparency. Me personally, I would say this is an understanding from the US, probably fed to them through the UK elements that are now operating in Damascus, that Jolani will not survive without the foreign elements in his militia. And Barrack goes on, and this is paraphrasing, it is better to keep the fighters, many of whom are very loyal to Syria's new administration, within a state project rather than exclude them. Because, of course, if they were to exclude them, what has been happening is those fighters who believe that Jolani has betrayed their extremist Takfiri roots and vision for Syria are now joining ISIS in Syria and turning against Jolani. Secondly, Tom Barrack also made comments that the US policy in Syria hasn't worked for 100 years and that it's time to change that policy. Of course, Trump tried this previously in his 2016 presidency. And this has been reported in Reuters, US to scale down its military bases in Syria, the envoy says. So Tom Barrack is basically saying they'll scale down from 8 bases to 1 and move further to the east. Now, coming back to the incorporation of foreign jihadists into the Syrian army, which raises certain questions, particularly with relation to China. This is an article from a Lebanese media outlet, the integration of 3,500 Uyghur jihadists. Now, that's slightly misleading because while the Uyghur jihadists are probably the majority of the foreigners joining Jolani's official new Syrian army, they number about 4,000 to 5,000 in Syria, but they are outnumbered by the Chechens and the Tunisians, so a little bit misleading. But however, what is not misleading is, I believe, the reasons behind allowing the Uyghurs to remain in Syria, which is all about curbing China's influence on the new Syrian government. This was a report from the Washington Institute, and if we have a look at what they actually said in the report, there are fears that China is making steps to get close to Jolani's government. A week after Assad fell, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi stated that he was deeply concerned and called for urgent efforts to prevent terrorist and extremist forces taking advantage of the chaos. 2 months later, however, Chinese Ambassador Shi Hongwei met with interim President Jolani in Damascus. So clearly, from America's perspective, they want to prevent Chinese influence again in Syria. And coming back to what we talked about last week, of course, all of this is happening also after the British have very much entered Damascus and are heavily influencing decisions that are taken in the Syrian capital and by Jolani. So if we just have a quick look at the article that's up at the UK column website, the Blair Bush Project in Syria that brought al-Qaeda to power, which goes into detail about the role of Jonathan Powell, connected to MI6, former chief of staff for Tony Blair, and now, of course, national security advisor to Keir Starmer. And who's actually running operations in Damascus? It appears to be this lady, Lucy Stewart. This has been confirmed to me by a number of people in Syria and in Damascus in particular. She's embedded in the new Syria Foreign Affairs Ministry and is helping to groom the members of Jolani's al-Qaeda government. She spent 5 years working for Saudi Arabia media. She's a graduate from the School of Oriental African Studies of Arabic and Farsi, joined Intermediate, Jonathan Powell's organization, in June 2015 and has been there ever since. And this is her job, to basically groom Jolani, or to transform Jolani from the terrorist that he was, Mohammed al-Jolani, into the president of Syria, if we can just see that. So basically the British involvement is having a huge effect, in my opinion, on US policy, but not only US policy. Israel also feels emboldened. There were reports yesterday of so-called resistance strikes against the occupied Golan Heights, occupied by Israel. And that led to blanket bombing by Israel yesterday of a number of sites in Syria. So Britain seems to have triggered a change in policy in the US and empowerment of the Jolani regime.
Vanessa, thank you very much indeed, and it's something we'll certainly come back to in extra. But for now, Law and Order, and published at the end of last month, is the independent sentencing review from the Ministry of Justice. There's just time to look at two of the provisions, the first being a measure which would set a very dangerous precedent indeed, so-called pharmaceutical interventions for those subject to criminal sanctions. And this is what the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, had to say about it.
Arousal.
And does that last forever? Is it permanent?
You have to keep taking the medication. The evidence, and these studies are quite small in number. There's not a huge evidence base here in terms of what we've got available to us in this country. But the evidence suggests that the combination of the drugs with psychological interventions is actually the best combination for ultimately reducing reoffending. What I've inherited from previous administrations is a very, very small scale pilot that's been running for some years in the Southwest. What I've decided is I think that this is a combination of medicine and psychological interventions that other countries are using to good effect. So more and more countries are taking this up. I'm not squeamish about doing this here. So I would like to see a national rollout of the current programme that we have. We're going to start with 2 regions and then progress to national rollout. It's a voluntary programme to start with, but I'm also exploring, whether mandation might be a way forward for us as well.
To force people to do.
Chemical castration, something she's apparently not squeamish about, and in many ways an extraordinary thing to listen to, especially when treated in such a bland manner. But you will have heard at the end of the clip, she referred to mandatory castration, which takes us back some decades. From the Auschwitz travelling exhibition, it is stated that the pseudo-medical experiments carried out including, for example, tests on sterilisation using iodine, X-rays or silver nitrate, castration of the subhumans. Now, not only that, but there's the extremely problematic issue of consent. And this is what the NHS has to say about that, which is that consent from a patient is needed regardless of the procedure. The principle of consent is an important part of medical ethics and international human rights law, something everybody will have a particular view on from what's happened over the last 5 years. But of course, put the other way around, the obstacle or at least the way round this particular obstacle, concerns capacity. And the health service goes on to say that the requirement for consent disappears with what they call a severe mental health condition, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, or dementia, and where the patient lacks the capacity to consent to the treatment of their mental health. Now, these are referred to as psychological interventions. And with regard to that, there's absolutely no evidence to substantiate the effectiveness of such, as seen here in the rather outdated scoring profile from the College of Policing, where the impact on crime is scored as low. Now, the preface of all this is an extremely alarmist statement, as put out by the Home Office, that we are facing a total breakdown of law and order. And as part of this narrative, Mahmood has also declared that she will sort out the very many issues confronting prisons, and in particular the spaces inside them. This is dealt with in the sentencing review to an extent, so the reporting here by the Telegraph is not quite as thorough as it ought to be. But they say that one way to reduce pressure on prisons is via what's called punishment in the community, which will, quote, restrict freedom, impose structure on an offender's day-to-day life, and require people to confront the causes and consequences of their actions, end quote. This follows the increasing trend towards the imposition of various orders, many of which do not even require involvement in a criminal offence. And then alongside all of this is the announcement that there's to be a prevent commissioner charged with, quote, stopping people from becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. It's likely that any reports produced by the interim commissioner will inform public policy around how counter-terrorism interacts with integration, public health, faith, and communities, and how these policy areas can support counter-terrorism efforts in the coming years. So the first agenda item, no doubt, will be to look at the review into the actions of Prevent with regard to Axel Rudikabana, currently serving a prison sentence in relation to the Southport killings of last year, who was, of course, well known to Prevent. Finally, on this subject, with the Liverpool traffic attack in mind, it's worth considering the government's push for self-driving vehicles, which was meant to take effect this year, 2025. Now, the Connected and Automated Mobility Report of 2022 predicated the transition on the theory of change, another instance of nudge or applied behavioural psychology. So it's not hard to see how the actions of Paul Doyle and the associated fanfare of attention could be used to engender public acceptance for automated vehicles. So this would be something that we keep an eye on. They say here that public trust and acceptance of any new technology is key to its success. And this is identified as a critical factor in our theory of change modelling. One particularly important factor in public acceptance is safety. So as I say, we'll see where that goes. Now, finally, to end on a positive, we've heard reports in from those that distribute the Light newspaper out in the Cheltenham area. They've had a really good response in recent times to what they're doing, and indeed to what's contained within the Light, which is, of course, an excellent read. And I would encourage you to get a copy of the most recent edition, not least because it deals with our UK column on location event back in April in Cheltenham. So great work, and please do keep in touch with stories like that, because it's very important to reflect that back to the audience that all of this does actually make a difference. Now, that's all we've got time for in the programme today, so I'll just leave you with a few reminders. First of all, don't forget to tune in to Diane's interview with Vicky Baggett tomorrow, and of course at 7 o'clock every evening during the week, at least Monday to Friday, we have the Germ Warfare podcast going out, and then starting in a few minutes we will have News Extra, so do tune into that. If you're not yet a member and therefore don't have access to Extra, please consider joining us as a member. And it just remains for me to thank Brian very much for joining me in the studio, and Vanessa and Sandy remotely. We will see you again on Friday, or indeed in a few minutes for Extra. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.